construction bosses, politicians, camp followers, thousands of workers, and 4 seemingly ordinary Sacramento storekeepers, 4 of the most unlikely giants I know, who got the whole thing started in the first place.
America had railroad fever in the 19th century. A steam engine could go faster than any other man-made conveyance. The idea of a railroad that joined East and West was a national dream. There were only wagon tracks across the wilderness that separated the far West from the rest of the nation. To bridge that wilderness with rails, it took 6 years and an army of 20,000 men, most of them immigrants from China and Europe. But above all, it took brute human effort, for it was built entirely by hand. To this day, no one knows how many died while building it, or what it really cost. No price seemed too great, for America believed that a railroad to the Pacific would be the key to westward expansion and the future of the country.
As early as the 1820s in the United States, you had this theory, if you want to call it that, of manifest destiny. That America was a land choice above all other lands, and that God had given it to the American people, and that they should own from ocean to ocean. No sooner did California become a state in 1850 than one of the great pressures and demands that they put on government, Washington, was to tie them closer to the east. And the only way that you could do that was with overland transportation.
Railroads already went to the Mississippi River. From there, most pioneers followed the Missouri to Nebraska's Platte River Valley to take the overland trail west.
As early as 1812, and then during the fur trade era, the Platte River became the major route for the supply train when they would bring the supplies out to the fur trade. In fact, time the fur trade ended in 1840, a blind man could have followed the route that came up the Platte River.
They watched the wagon trains go by. They don't interfere with any of that. They're just amazed at the determination of the people to bring such a monstrous, contraption through these rough hills.
And they were going over trails that had been originally probably game trails, then Indian trails, trails that had been covered by thousands of immigrants as they moved westward.
But for these pioneers, the trip was 1,800 miles of savage moonscape, a place of hardship, weather, and distance, unlike anything they had ever seen. And many said the last 100 miles were the worst of all. The Sierra Nevada mountains of California.
At that time, people were still lucky to get across the Sierra, even in summer. There was traffic in summer, but it was a great barrier. Nobody went across in winter that was in their right mind.
These mountains were considered an impassable barrier to any railroad. Anyone wanting to build one through the Sierra had to be stark raving mad. In Sacramento, there was an ambitious young civil engineer from Troy, New York, named Theodore Judah. For years, he had dreamed of doing the impossible, of finding a way to lay tracks across the Sierra Nevada. He spent the summer of 1860 in the Sierra exploring a promising new route. Within a year, Theodore Judah was known in Sacramento as Crazy Judah. He was trying to convince a skeptical public that he had found a route for a railroad leading eastward, back over the mountains from Sacramento.
It was a masterpiece, or it was brilliant the way that Theodore Judah went up there with just a notebook and a horse and figured out he could build a railroad across the Sierras.
The miracle of Judah's discovery was that from the Sacramento Valley that they found a series of ridges that led, by going from ridge to ridge, it led all the way to the summit of Donner Pass.
And if he could get to Donner Pass, he could get across the Sierra Nevada. Judah formed a company to build the railroad and called it the Central Pacific. All he needed now was money.
A big pitch was made in San Francisco to try and get subscribers or to try and help get the railroad formed by some big financiers. And that went just right down the tubes. No one in San Francisco really believed him. They crossed the street whenever they saw him coming. And so Ted Judah became sort of a monomaniac on the subject of building a transcontinental railroad.
But Judah's mountain route made sense to 4 shrewd Sacramento shopkeepers. Charlie Crocker ran a dry goods store. Collis Huntington and Mark Hopkins were partners in a hardware business. And Leland Stanford was a grocer with big-time political ambitions. Judah had persuaded them that a railroad to the gold mines in the Sierra and the silver mines in Nevada beyond could make enough money to pay for its own construction.
So slowly the big 4 were won over. And most people in Sacramento thought they had lost their minds because they were listening to crazy Judah.
The risks of failure and financial ruin were huge, but the big 4 also saw potentially enormous rewards.
The real sharp money man, Huntington, began to sense that it was conceivable that there could be some big money, not from investing in it, not from dividends, not from hauling any freight, but just by constructing the darn thing or trying to, because they could be paid so much a mile for its construction.
Congress was interested in supporting the railroad, but couldn't decide on a route. Southerners in Congress wanted a southern route. Northerners wanted a northern route that followed the Pioneer Trail out the Platte River Valley.
But when that Civil War broke out, it's no longer a political issue. The South pulled out of government and it left the North to do whatever they wanted. And thus they picked that northern route.
Spurred by the adept lobbying of Judah and Huntington, Congress passed the first of 2 acts that were to make the Transcontinental Railroad possible. The Railroad Act named 2 companies. The Central Pacific was to build eastward from Sacramento. A new company called the Union Pacific was to build westward, up the Platte River Valley from Omaha, Nebraska. While the Union Pacific tried to get organized, out in California, the Central Pacific began to mobilize. From Washington, D.C., Huntington wired his partners in Sacramento. "We have drawn the elephant. Now let us see if we can harness him." Judah soon found himself odd man out on his own railroad. Impractical and impatient, he quarreled with the Big 4 over business ethics and engineering. Deciding to buy his partners out, Judah set off for New York to raise money. From San Francisco, going around Cape Horn to the East Coast would take 5 months. Overland at least 2. So he took the shortcut, a 30-day trip by ship via Panama. In those pre-canal days, the isthmus could only be crossed overland. While there, he caught a fatal case of yellow fever. Judah died in the fall of 1862, just as the Big 4 were organizing their supply operation. It took 40 flat cars to carry the material for a mile of track. There had to be feed for draft animals and wood for buildings, bridges, and 2,500 ties per mile of track. Mountain sawmills began cutting wooden cross ties, but that was about all that could be made for the railroad in California.
The CP had a tremendous problem because they had nothing in California that they could work with except men and wood. The ties were no problem, but the locomotives, the rail, the cars, the wheels, anything that was heavy industry all had to be made back east and shipped around the Horn in ships. It was about a 5-6 month journey around the Horn to get that material to California.
Cape Horn is one place that's probably nastier weather than Donner Pass. And so it was an incredible supply line. And 15,000 miles, when you get down to it, was only at the start because they still had to work up into the Sierra. And so everything had to go 15,000 miles plus.
Facing this monumental task, the Big Four built a strong organization. Collis Huntington was the craftiest of the four and spent most of his time in New York raising money and buying equipment. Mark Hopkins, the financial officer, ran the day-to-day business. Leland Stanford got himself elected governor of California and built a strong pro-railroad political machine. Charlie Crocker took charge of construction, the toughest job of all. He was vain, cocky, and arrogant. He had no experience with railroads, but he had self-confidence, energy, and he was a born manipulator. It appealed to Crocker's sense of the dramatic to appear on payday with 150 pounds of gold and silver coin so that he could personally dole out the payroll. It made the men remember where it was coming from. At the outset, the going was easy across the Sacramento Valley, but within 20 miles, they were bridging the ravines of the Sierra foothills. The Newcastle Trestle was a 400-foot span made from timbers dragged in by teams of oxen. It was to be the first of many. When ridges barred the way, they had to carve and blast straight through them. Construction was tough enough, but even worse, there was a chronic labor shortage. Most able-bodied men were trying to strike it rich in the gold and silver mines. There was a large Chinese workforce, drawn at first to California by the gold rush. Anti-Chinese prejudice was strong, and Crocker had never thought of these people as the solution to his labor problem.
The superintendent of the railroad was having such a difficult time getting white labor to work on the railroads. They would come and work for a day or two and then leave, or else get drunk and be unruly on the job, and there were always fights. Next day, some of them would not show up, and finally, in desperation, Stanford said, "Why don't we try the Chinese?" And the superintendent said, "Well, how can small Chinese could do such a heavy job as carrying ties and railroad tracks?" And that's when Stanford, or one of his assistants, says, "Well, they built the Chinese wall, didn't they?" And they brought in a team and tried them for a while. And they were amazed when they found out that statistically they were doing a better job than the much heavier Caucasian workers.
They were a needed labor force, and they were hired first in groups of 50 and then later hundreds, and finally, to the number of 10,000 plus. And they were called Crocker's Army in the High Sierras, and later they were nicknamed Crocker's Pets because, again, the put down of Chinese workers. Certainly the Chinese were very, very separate from the white workers.
It was a case of surviving in each other's company. I tried to have as little to do with you as you wanted to have as little to do with me, because our customs are different. I can't even carry an ordinary conversation with you because I don't speak English and you don't speak Chinese, so why should we talk?
Their diet was different. Their habits were different.
They loved to gamble.
but most of all, for relaxation from their labors, many of them relied on opium, just enough to get them into a restful slumber. It was a common thing. It was not an outlawed item in those days.
One of the strongest images the Chinese Americans have of the working on the railroad is, Chinese workers being hung over cliffs in baskets, which they wove themselves. And they planted charges, and they had to either scramble up the lines, if the charges were short, or be pulled up very quickly by their comrades. And then they were lowered down to drill again. But when they were pulled up, frequently the explosions would be right under them. So it was very, very dangerous work.
Nearly 2,000 of them died or were severely wounded building the western part of the railroad.
Within 1 year, the army of Chinese had swollen to 6,000 men. On the Central Pacific, 9 out of 10 were Chinese. In 3 years of fighting the Sierra, this skilled army of men and engineers had been able to lay only 40 miles of track. The company had spent $8 million and was deep in debt. Said Crocker, "I would gladly have traded all I had for the debts I owed and started all over again and never heard of the Pacific Railroad." In the East, constructing the Union Pacific across the Nebraska prairie should have been easy. But the Union Pacific did not have the Californians' tight-knit leadership. What it had instead was one Thomas C. Durant, a vice president with a scheming mind, a taste for power, and a nose for easy money. He was already taking kickbacks from construction subcontractors. Tom Durant was in it for the glory and from greed. After 3 years, the Union Pacific had spent $500,000 and had laid only 40 miles of track, or as one newspaper said, 2 streaks of rust across the Nebraska prairie. To salvage the fortunes of the Union Pacific, Durant offered the job of chief construction engineer to a young Union general named Grenville Dodge, a civil engineer. During the Civil War, Dodge had built railroads so fast that they used to say of him, "We don't know where he is, but we can tell where he has been." Dodge knew Tom Durant all too well and said in his letter of acceptance to Durant, "I will agree to work for the Union Pacific, but I must have absolute control in the field." In a letter to his brother, Dodge voiced his private concerns. "The Union Pacific would pay me well, but I am afraid I might have trouble with Durant." In fact, he was to have nothing but trouble. Durant was interested in money, Dodge in building a railroad. His job as chief engineer was to select the precise route. Dodge was tough and uncompromising. His leadership would be crucial. It was now May 1866. To keep its government contract, the Union Pacific had to reach the 100th meridian by December, 250 miles across Nebraska. Finding wood for ties on Nebraska's nearly treeless prairie was one of the Union Pacific's greatest problems. At first, they were made in Omaha sawmills, but as time went by, woodcutters were making hand-hewn ties in mountain forests further west.
My grandfather was here at the time the railroad was being built through here in 1868. He come up into the woods here and made ties until up about 1897. An average tie hack would make 30 to 40. A real good tie hack could make up to 60 or 70 ties in a day, provided that he has excellent timber to chop. The price of ties ranged from a low of about 8 cents on to up to 65 cents during the time that they were cutting ties in the woods here. They cut them in the winter, summer, and whenever they could be in the woods, they were here most of the time.
The ties were brought to the end of track along with rail and hardware. There were already surveying teams and grading crews clear across Nebraska and Wyoming, deep into Indian territory. The Sioux and other Plains Indians were watching with growing concern. This was nothing less than trespass.
It wasn't a, people passing through, leaving a trail or ruts in the ground, but now you had a permanent situation where there was rails that were permanently embedded in the ground.
They call it maza chunku. Maza is iron, any kind of metal. Chunku is road, so it's iron road. And that's how they describe the railroad track. They thought these people were really crazy trying to do this, and they were amazed at the determination of the white people. They said when they set their mind to do something, they do it. Regardless of what might be in the way, if they have a goal, they'll reach it. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's dangerous, depending on who's in the way.
The Indians were right to worry. An invasion was on the way. With the Civil War over, the frontier was moving westward, and with it, a flood of fresh manpower.
The Union Pacific laborers came from all walks of life. They came from Europe, Irishmen, a lot of Germans, a lot of Dutch, Czechoslovakians, and Civil War veterans. And so a lot of those vets came out and got a job on the UP, build the railroad for $1 a day.
These were the pick and shovel men, the teamsters, the blacksmiths, the masons, the carpenters, the mechanics, and the track layers. The track laying crew was managed by the Casement brothers, Dan and Jack, both barely 5 feet tall and both tough as nails.
They dressed like Cossacks, and they were hard men, and they really flung the whip around, really. They made the men work really hard. They kept them going.
Their crew of several hundred men lived in a city on wheels, 20 cars that contained dormitories, a kitchen, a telegraph office, and an arsenal car with 1,000 loaded rifles. The teamwork needed to lay track was as complex as it was lively. 75 years later, Hollywood movies reenacted the operation that had been described by a reporter who was there in 1866 and who wrote, 4 men seize a rail. Less than 30 seconds to a rail, and so 4 rails go down to the minute. It is a grand anvil chorus. 3 strokes to the spike, 10 spikes to the rail, 400 rails to the mile, 1,800 miles to San Francisco. Before long, the Union Pacific was laying a mile or more a day. To celebrate reaching the 100th meridian, 247 miles west of Omaha, Durant threw a party that was lavish even by the standards of the Gilded Age. Durant could use some good publicity. He invited the press, the big bankers, the Washington Diplomatic Corps, and the entire Congress. All told, 140 came. The Sioux, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne looked on in fury. There were treaties that protected Indian land in Nebraska and Wyoming, but the government was now dissolving those agreements and simply taking the land for the railroad.
Basically, the provisions of the treaty were that Indian people gave up some surrounding land but retained that specific land for themselves and their future generations. And really, no white man would ever be allowed on that land. We are a warrior society. The Sioux have always been known for their ability to fight. The Indian had no alternative but to go to war, to defend his homeland and family.
Indian attack came without warning. The Union Pacific had to act as its own army. Work crews were armed, and many were battle-hardened. But inexperienced immigrants must have been terrified. In 1866 and 67, there were many attacks. For Dodge, the growing Indian resistance was a serious problem. He wrote, "We've got to clean the Indian out or give up. The government may take its choice."
It was very common knowledge very early in the history between military and Indians that if you want to get rid of the Indian, all you've got to do is kill off the buffalo. Time the railroad come in 1869, the buffalo was already on the way to extinction. All the railroad did was speed it up.
When the buffalo hunters came in, the hide hunters come in, people panic because the buffalo is a source of our life. It's our lodge, it's our food. When all the buffalo was wiped out, you know, there was no way we could have stopped them. I mean, it happened so quick that I think that's one reason why the Indian white people eventually submitted, because they just don't have the means anymore.
And the railroad themselves never taken time to stop and saying, hey, Mr. Indian, is there something that the two of us can do jointly to enhance, you know, those issues on a reservation that would improve the quality of life? Those were never addressed by the railroad people. So as a result, Indian people to this day have never really realized anything in behalf of the railroads.
And you hear that whistle blowing in the distance. And older people would cry with that sound. So that whistle brings back a lot of sad memories. People are constantly reminded of what happened.
For 2 years, the Plains Indians attacked the Union Pacific across Nebraska. But there was no stopping the Iron Road. It moved like a juggernaut through the tribal lands of the Sioux and the Arapaho of Nebraska, the Cheyenne and the Shoshone of Wyoming, the Paiutes of Nevada, and the Maidus of California. The Indian cause held little interest for Grenville Dodge, but he too was a warrior. And in grudging admiration, he borrowed the tribal name Cheyenne for the railroad's first town in Wyoming. The tracks arrived late in 1867, turning the sleepy outpost into one of the wildest towns on the frontier.
Sometimes they worked 7 days a week, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. When they had a weekend, they would go to the nearest town, and all there was in that town were saloons, houses of prostitution, and that was the only recreation they would ever get, was drinking and chasing the girls.
Gamblers and prostitutes moved to the end of track and set up shop. They called this movable Sin City Hell on Wheels. A reporter wrote about one of these places. Verily, men earn their money like horses and spend it like asses.
It seemed like railroaders always liked to fight when they got off duty. They were known as good fighters, good two-fisted fighters, good drinkers. They could hold their liquor.
Murders outnumbered accidental deaths by 4 to 1. Taking the law into his own hands, Jack Casement led a heavily armed crew of his toughest track layers into Laramie, Wyoming, and went after its worst incorrigibles. He reported to Dodge that few of the sinners had survived the encounter. The country was getting rougher through eastern Wyoming, and costs were rising. To save money, Durant wanted to build a lengthy bypass around difficult terrain. Dodge argued that the most direct route would be the best, in spite of the expense. In a showdown, Dodge won. The result, a 650-foot bridge across the Dale Creek Canyon. It was the longest trestle on the line. It swayed in the wind and was terrifying to cross.
The thing that I think about is what it must have been like to work as a brakeman riding the tops of the cars. The wind blows up there 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, and they're up in high open country. Coming across that Dale Creek Bridge, for instance, quite a steep grade, 150 feet from the bottom of that canyon, a 50-mile-an-hour wind, and jumping from car to car in the middle of the night in a snowstorm. I don't know how they did it. Of course, their life expectancy wasn't too long then either. So if a man said he worked for the railroad, people just immediately thought of him as having one of the most dangerous jobs in the world.
They had boiler explosions in those days. And of course, a boiler explosion was totally fatal to the crew. They just never survived. And of course, there was bad track. The railroads were not good, and they could run off the track, tip over.
But the side sway is what it scares you. When you're up off the ground in a locomotive or in a car, the side sway becomes so great that you think, surely I'm going to tip over at any moment. Sometimes they just had too much train for the amount of brake. They'd loaded the trains too heavy, and the brakes simply wouldn't hold the train back. So runaways were common, and most of the time the men would jump. They'd probably break their leg or break their arm, but at least they wouldn't be scalded to death at the bottom of a terrible derailment.
They were dangerous. You hardly ever saw a railroad man back in them days, but what didn't have a finger or two gone. Most of these old railroaders, they have them dubbed off, maybe just this much and maybe that much. Some of them have two of them dubbed off. And we had one old conductor here, he had a wheel run over his foot and cut the front end of his foot off. All them steam engines, I never found hardly one that rode nice and smooth and just shake the living liver out of you.
You had a variety of weather, every kind imaginable, all the way from Omaha to Death, Nevada. There's a scanner out there right now that talks to us when we go by. Highball your train, today's temperature, minus 37 degrees. It just seems like it gets a little colder inside the engine every time we hear that.
Oh, it's cold. And there was no heat in the cab. That all went in the firebox door when they had it open. It was either burning your backsides or you was freezing them. There wasn't no happy medium to it.
If you were in the desert area where the ambient was 110, you were going to be about 150 to 60 degrees in an engine cab, which is pretty uncomfortable.
These weather conditions aren't new. They've been here forever.
In fact, from Cheyenne west, there is some of the harshest weather in the country. Dodge himself wrote sourly about it. Central Wyoming was desolate, dreary, not susceptible of cultivation, and only portions of it fit for grazing. Even tough little Jack Casement wrote to his wife, "This is an awful place. Alkali dust knee-deep. We haul all our water 50 miles. We're losing a great many mules. 6 nice fat ones died in less than an hour today." In yet another scheming move, Durant, wanting to increase his control, publicly tried to embarrass Dodge. At a Wyoming gathering of powerful men that included President-to-be General U.S. Grant, Durant accused Grenville Dodge of overspending and incompetence. But the scheme backfired. Grant and the others fully supported Dodge, forcing Durant to back down, for the moment. Out west, the Central Pacific was having troubles of its own. Above 6,000 feet, the Sierra Nevada is a world of naked granite. At the highest point on the line, a massive ridge blocked the way. The Chinese crews were going to have to blast a tunnel of over 1,600 feet through the hardest rock any of the engineers had ever seen. No one believed it could be finished in less than 3 years.
And of course, they had people working day and night. They were only making inches a day through that rock.
They drilled holes in the rock face to hold the explosives. All they had were sledgehammers and steel drills. It took 3 8-hour shifts just to make a 12-inch hole.
This is a piece of drill steel that was originally used for drilling the powder holes in the tunnels through the rock. So this drill steel didn't last them very long. They probably got a couple hours use before it had to be reshaped and sharpened by a blacksmith.
When they had drilled holes every 2 feet in the rock face, they poured black blasting powder into the holes, an extremely dangerous operation.
And that's why they had to be taught how to use the black powder and how to set it off, how to set the charge, and how long to make the fuse, and how to clear out in time.
They worked the tunnel from both ends. Every day they used 400 kegs of blasting powder to make barely a foot of headway on each face. Charlie Crocker was so concerned about the pace that he brought in a violently powerful new explosive.
It was the first time that they had used nitroglycerin. You couldn't be careful enough with it. The slightest jar, or if you'd have dropped it, you'd have been gone, you know, if you had a vial of it. And it was just too dangerous to work with.
Nitroglycerin doubled their rate of progress, but there was a terrible price. After several fatal accidents, Crocker got rid of the nitroglycerin and never used it again.
The construction people gave it up and went back to black powder, which they were more familiar with, but which was every bit as dangerous to handle. Blasters would stick the drill back in there to stem and tamp the powder down. They get a little spark in between the rock and the drill bit, and it would explode.
After a year of work, on August 29, 1867, daylight shone through the summit tunnel. Both ends lined up according to plan. 1,600 feet long, it was, at the time, the longest tunnel of its kind in the world.
The tunnel is almost perfect. It's within just a couple of inches of being perfect. I would like to see that done again today with the modern technology.
Within 2 months, track was laid through the tunnel and trains were running. They had been at it for 5 years, but they were only 100 miles east of Sacramento, and they still had not solved their greatest problem: winter weather.
The snow depths and the snow problem was totally underestimated. In fact, every once in a while, even today, it gets underestimated. You get a few years of light snowfall and light winter, and everyone will kind of drop their guard, and then Mother Nature will show you she still owns it.
With the draft that you get through these tunnels and the ice buildup that we have, it's Not unusual to be down to 30 below zero as chill factor in these tunnels. If you're in here digging ice by hand, and we still do that, 8 or 10 hours, you're really cold. It's like working in a deep freeze.
During the winter of 1866-67, it took nearly half the Central Pacific workforce of 9,000 men just to keep the tracks shoveled. One of the engineers described how they tried to plow the tracks at first. A push plow, loaded with pig iron with 3 engines behind, would back up and take a run at the snow and keep going until it got stuck, and then back up and take another run.
And they backed up and took a big, hefty 30-mile-an-hour swing at that snowdrift that was in that cut. The front engine went on the ground, was crushed by the rear engine, and the crew was killed. So it was a dangerous job to run those snowbuckers, but that's literally what they did. It was just a matter of backing up and taking a great big fast run on it and see if they could buck through it.
But the tracks were often snowed in for weeks at a time.
They discovered that they couldn't keep it open in the winter. So they came in and they enclosed the track. They built wooden snow sheds. So all the tracks were enclosed, for the most part, under these sheds. And this enabled them to have a year-round operation.
By the time they were through, the Central Pacific had built 40 miles of wooden snow sheds. Crews toiled straight through these winters, but this was all new to the Chinese.
They had never seen snow before because they were in an area of South China where snow, if it fell every quarter century or so, would be something new to them. And a lot of them were frostbitten, hands, feet, toes, and so forth, and a lot of them got pneumonia.
They had to make do with what they had. A little wood fire, as best of an enclosure as they could put together. Some type of shelter, which we know wasn't near adequate.
The greatest casualties was the avalanches during the winter that carried whole crews over the edge of mountains, and they wouldn't find their bodies until the following spring.
By the end of March 1868, the Central Pacific had cut through the ruggedest mountains on the transcontinental route. Though they had built only 131 miles in 6 years, it was a miraculous achievement. To the east, the Union Pacific had laid 700 miles across much more level terrain. But they now faced their toughest test, the rugged buttes and canyons of western Wyoming and Utah. About halfway between the two companies were the thriving Mormon communities in Utah's Salt Lake Valley. Both railroads saw that whoever got to Salt Lake first could establish a depot and capture the lucrative Salt Lake business. A race was shaping up.
And yes, there was a race on, no question about it. In fact, history tells us that they actually surveyed right past each other. There was a lot of competition going on. There was a lot of money at stake.
Dodge told Charlie Crocker's engineers they could never win this race. But Charlie Crocker rose to the challenge. He loved a race. He said, "Give me the material and I can build a mile a day." And he did. The pressure was building on Crocker. Huntington wired from New York, "By God, Charlie, you must work as man never worked before. Our salvation is you, so work on as though heaven was before you and hell behind you." The Union Pacific was now laying better than a mile a day across Wyoming. They rushed into Echo and Utah's Wasatch Mountains. In early March 1869, in a canyon leading down to Salt Lake, at the base of a great fir tree, they reached mile 1,000.
And they were trying to get as far west as they possibly could, so they were just slapdash throwing the railroad together. there just wasn't anything there except the very necessities to get the engine and cars over the track.
In the spring of 1869, both companies entered the Salt Lake Valley and graded roadbeds right past each other, each laying claim to the right-of-way. This was a race with no rules and no finish line. The government handed the two companies an ultimatum: fix a meeting point or we'll do it for you. Dodge and Huntington met in Washington and cut a deal. The two companies would share the Salt Lake traffic, and the tracks would meet in 1 month at Promontory, Utah. The eyes of the nation were drawn to this remote spot and to the celebration that would commemorate the great event. The joining of the tracks would achieve what nothing else had: the unification of the East and the West. Shiny new trains with officials set out from Sacramento and Omaha. The date was set for May 7th, but there was to be a 3-day delay, at first because of weather. Flash floods washed out track, delaying the Omaha trains. The Central Pacific people waited at Promontory, without knowing about a melodrama taking place about 100 miles back on the Union Pacific line. 300 angry, unpaid workers had kidnapped Durant. They only released him when the New York Board of Directors wired $500,000 to local subcontractors so they could make payroll. Durant may have staged the whole thing so that he could collect a kickback from the subcontractors, 10% of the $500,000. Grenville Dodge was headed for fame and success, but what with Durant and the pressures of the race, his mood had darkened. He wrote his wife from Promontory, "I never saw so much needless waste. There will not be much of a time here, but farther west and back east there may be something. So be sure to fly the flag." The skies cleared over Promontory on the morning of May 10th. The centerpiece of the ceremony would be the joining of the last rails and the driving of the last spike, the golden spike. It was to be a simple affair by Victorian standards, but its symbolic power riveted the attention of the nation. Western Union offered live coverage direct from the scene to a waiting nation. There were reporters and even 3 photographers to immortalize the ceremony. The event marked the culmination of 6 years of backbreaking labor. No longer 2 streaks of rust, newspapers were calling it the work of the age. Durant represented the Union Pacific and Leland Stanford the Central Pacific. Durant was to drive a silver spike, Stanford a golden one. Durant managed to tap his into a pre-drilled hole. When it was Stanford's turn, he missed. But the nation never knew. The telegraph signaled done, and a legend was born. Church bells and factory whistles across the land chorused in celebration. Behind the ceremonial facade, there was a feeling of exhaustion and anticlimax. Dodge and a Central Pacific official had a disagreement over protocol that almost canceled the ceremony. When it was over, officials hurried back along their new line to distant cities. Work crews disappeared. The next day, Promontory was nearly deserted. Just another whistle stop on the national dream. But the thing was done. Now you could get to San Francisco from New York in 10 days. But the anticipated wave of settlers did not come right away, and most of the freight for the West Coast continued to go by ship around the Horn well into the next decade. But the railroad had opened the heart of the continent and changed it forever.
And all of a sudden, out of the clear blue sky, you know, to have a train belching smoke, they had never before envisioned anything like this and had never ever, even in their wildest dreams, foretold something like this coming.
North Platte, Cheyenne, Promontory, Battle Mountain, Reno, and Sacramento.
The men that built the railroad were hard people. You can imagine driving spikes all day long. You know, they just drifted into the woodwork. Most of them went into becoming farmers because there was so much land out here for them, and it was easy to get, and it was cheap.
Some Chinese went back to San Francisco and got jobs in construction work. And one Chinese railroad worker went back to China and built a railroad, the Sunning Railroad in southern China. It was a source of pride that one of our ancestors worked on a monumental American road, which they called the Teet Lo. Teet Lo means iron road.
To find out more about this program and the American experience, visit PBS Online on the Internet. Set your web browser to www.pbs.org.
Stay tuned to KERA 13 for the latest news update from the News Hour with Jim Lehrer.
A presentation of WGBH Boston. Major funding for the American experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And the annual financial support of viewers like you.
And by Scott's Lawn Care Products. With Scott's Turf Builder, anyone can turn their own little piece of America into a place to be cherished. Season after season after season.
The program you have just seen is available on home video cassette for $19.95 plus shipping and handling. To order, call 1-800-255-9424.
This is PBS.
Local broadcast of this program is made possible in part by Half Price Books, the bookseller's bookstore for 25 years. Half Price Books features a wide selection of new and used books and music. Because Half Price Books buys from the public, the stock changes daily. Half Price Books, with 11 North Texas locations.
Hi, I'm John Tesh. Since 1960, KERA has been music to your ears, and its programs are made possible by individual members. If you made a pledge during KERA's recent membership drive, then thank you. If you haven't mailed your check, please do so today. When you fulfill your pledge, your dollars go to work providing quality musical programs like the Avalon Concert. Please return your check in the envelope sent to you so that KERA may send you your thank you gift and continue to bring you the finest in public television. And if you didn't make a pledge, it's not too late. Please mail your check to KERA, 3000 Harry Hines Boulevard, Dallas, Texas, 75201. And thank you.
Pablo Escobar, the richest, most violent criminal in history.
Escobar is probably the head of the largest criminal organization the world's ever known. Escobar was to cocaine what Ford was to automobiles.
Next time on Frontline, the godfather of cocaine.
Tuesday at 9 on KERA 13.
Leadership is commitment to the community. Quality programming on Dallas Public Television is made possible by the Texas law firm of Winstead, Sechrist, and Minnick in Dallas, Houston, Austin, and Mexico City. Winstead, Sechrist, and Minnick, business lawyers who understand business.
Next on Mystery.
You should do as I always do. Consult Brother Cadfael.
Do not dismiss Brother Oswin's fears so lightly, nor the power of evil.
In this world, all men are fallible.
I know what I heard and saw, brother.
Ellis Peters' Cadfael.
Do you truly believe he is murdered? Or do you merely wish it so? Seek absolution before this thing presses you down into hell.
Thursday at 8 on KERA 13. Your ticket to the arts. This is KERA, Channel 13. Local broadcast of the News Hour with Jim Lehrer is made possible in part by North Park Center, dedicated to bringing Texas world-class shopping with over 160 specialty stores. North Park Center, devoted to excellence in retail for more than 31 years. And by Comerica Bank, Texas, now with more than 35 locations throughout the Metroplex. Comerica Bank, member FDIC.
Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the News Hour tonight, the growing crisis in the Middle East. We get official Israeli and Palestinian perspectives. Special correspondent Hedrick Smith begins a series on campaign fundraising, and we have updates on two deadly diseases, the tuberculosis of today and the flu of 1918. It all follows our summary of the news this Monday.
Major funding for the News Hour with Jim Lehrer has been provided by the Archer Daniels Midland Company, ADM, supermarket to the world. And by New York Life, yet another example of New York Life's wise investment philosophy. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support from viewers like you.
The Palestinian Authority today rejected Israeli demands for a crackdown on Islamic militants. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu called for the action after a suicide bomber killed 3 women in Tel Aviv on Friday. The militant group Hamas took responsibility for the blast. Palestinian Security Chief Mohammed Dahlan said his people were not waiting for orders from Israel to crack down on militants. He said the recent bombing was provoked by Israeli plans to build housing in East Jerusalem. At the White House, spokesman Mike McCurry said all steps must be taken to prevent further violence in the region.
We need to make sure that that everyone expends every effort necessary to see that terror is stopped and thwarted. You can't be 100% effective, no doubt, in fighting terrorism, but you can expend 100% effort. That's what we are calling for. We don't condone extra constitutional means to achieve those objectives, but we understand we're dealing with dangerous people. And as always, you have to expend an extra effort when it comes to law enforcement when you're dealing with desperately dangerous people.
In the West Bank town of Hebron, Palestinian protesters clashed with Israeli troops for a 5th straight day. But today, hundreds of Palestinian police formed a human chain to keep the two groups apart. We'll have more on this Middle East story right after the news summary. On the Zaire story today, Secretary of Defense Cohen said additional U.S. troops will be sent to Central Africa to prepare for the evacuation of Americans from Zaire. The first wave of U.S. troops arrived in Congo Sunday across the river from Kinshasa, the capital of Zaire. About 500 Americans live in Zaire. The country has been in a civil war for 7 months. Vice President Gore arrived in Beijing